About a week or two ago, we discussed what Apple Silicon, or Apple on ARM, means for developers. Today, we're switching gears just a bit and discussing Windows on ARM. Stick around. Hey everyone, welcome back to Today in Tech. I'm Juliet Beauchamp. I'm here with InfoWorld senior writer Serdar Yegilalp, as well as Computer World contributing editor Preston Gralla. Thank you both so much for joining me. And like I mentioned, we're going to be discussing what Windows ARM is really entailing for developers and why it's slightly different than Apple Silicon. So my first question to you both, I'm just going to hand it off right to you, is what is Windows on ARM, who is it for, and what devices are currently using it?
I'll start off. Windows on ARM is pretty much what it says, Windows for ARM devices. Now, there's a long, somewhat sad history of Windows on ARM because the first version of it was called Windows RT, that was based on the Windows 8 operating system, which was one of the worst operating systems Microsoft has ever built. And Windows RT did something remarkable, made that operating system worse. The problem with that device was that it only ran what Microsoft called Metro apps, which are sort of this new generation of apps that hope that the world was going to go to and abandon desktop apps, also called Windows 32 apps. So that did not go over well. It kind of faded away. Eventually, though, Microsoft decided to keep Windows on ARM. So today, it does exist. It's really a niche operating system. It's really essentially for devices that are like Chromebooks. That's the basic idea of them. They're not going to be powerful. They can capably run desktop apps if they're 32-bit desktop apps, but they can't run 64-bit apps. And that's problematic, mainly because you never know when you download whether it's going to be the 64 or 32-bit version. Sometimes you know, sometimes you won't. But these are basically Chromebook devices like the Surface Pro X. Lenovo has some out, the Lenovo Yoga 5, I think it's called. Oddly enough, these devices, even though they're Chromebook-like, they're web first, as Microsoft says, they're very expensive. Windows Pro X, for example, $900, $1,700. Very, very high price for essentially what's a glorified Chromebook. And that's basically Windows on ARM. It's a sideshow for Microsoft. It's not like Apple. It's not like the whole ecosystem is moving. It's just a small niche market, not a big market for Microsoft. Basically, they just want to have skin in the game.
As far as what devices like this mean for developers, it's really kind of paradoxical because developers themselves are used to working with reasonably high-end machines to get their work done. So if you spent the same $900 or $1,000 on one of these machines, which means just kind of astonishing for what amounts to a Chromebook, if you took that same amount of money and you spent it on a machine that's more developer-oriented, like one of Lenovo's machines, you'd have something much more powerful that would run the full gamut of Windows software, 32 and 64-bit. You wouldn't have all of the silly restrictions that would come with running ARM, and you'd have a better machine overall. So as far as what it means for an individual developer, they're almost certainly not going to buy one of these devices themselves to do any actual development work. The only reason that they would want to have one of them at all would be for the sake of checking the compatibility of an existing application. Even that might be a moot point, as we'll go into that a little bit later. So for devs, owning one of these machines, working with a Windows on ARM machine is pretty much a non-starter.
I'm curious, Preston, perhaps this is a question for you as sort of more of our Windows guy here, but if it seems like there's not much benefit in using a Windows on ARM device, what's kind of the point?
If we had Microsoft here, we could ask them. Maybe they could tell us. I really think it's almost a kind of insurance policy. I don't think they're really that serious about it. I think it's really, like I said before, to have skin in the game, just in case. And, there is a possibility that there could be a real reason for these devices to exist. The world is not just going mobile, the world is going remote. And, if you could get a reasonably priced device that's inexpensive, that will run Windows software, first of all, web stuff, that's the most important thing. And, there is Office. There's really nice online versions of Office. It's not for professional writers, let's say, professional people who are going to do a lot of data work with Excel, but for most people, typical office workers, you could run those, they're really pretty good. So I could see a potential future, but right now with the prices and right now with Chromebooks being strong, I honestly don't really know why they're still doing this.
There was a piece that Jason Perlow at ZDNet wrote a couple of weeks ago that has some points in it that I think I agree with about why this was introduced and where it might be headed. And you said it might be an insurance policy. That coincided with some of the things that he was talking about the idea that since we're not only going mobile, we're also going cloud first. And so what Microsoft may trying to create with one of these devices is essentially a cloud first Windows device. Instead of running the vast majority of your stuff natively, you run it in emulation on a cloud machine and you have it streamed to that device. And Microsoft has been talking about doing basically streamed remote versions of Windows on Azure for some time now, not just as a server thing, but also as individual virtual desktops. So and that's actually something they've already offered as a service, and this could just be a further refinement of that. But again, when it comes to actually having one of these things for their own sake, if you're going to spend $800 to $900, you might as well spend it on a full-blown machine. So I don't see this really having much of a significance until the prices are on a par with Chromebook, or for $900 we get something that is just impossible to have anywhere else. But right now, if I spend $900, I can have it all anyway.
Yes, Sardar, you're right. And you're especially right about the insurance policy. I think that's really what's for. I mean, given the pandemic, given global warming, and we know there's bigger storms coming, given all that, the future is certainly, even the present is remote, but the future will probably even be more remote. And Microsoft basically when people think of Microsoft, they think of Windows, but the truth is Microsoft is now essentially a cloud company. And so, Sardar, you're absolutely right that, running things through the cloud, this could be their way to get into it, but of course, like you said, the prices have to drop.
And now that I think about it, there's also that much more movement towards giving developers remote hosted, cloud hosted resources that they can use in a remote way. Coding in the browser, for instance, or having a browser based coding environment. And they're not terrible. They're actually coming along pretty decently. They're not bad at all, as long as your style of work fits nicely into what's being offered. But this just being the first generation of that, I imagine there's a lot of improvement to come. So there may well be something for the developer here too, as this whole business of using cloud hosted resources and web hosted resources to do coding start to mature further.
So I'm wondering too, and this sort of brings me to my next point, what's the situation with applications for both developers and maybe even a bit on the user side? You've mentioned that on these Windows on ARM devices, you can pretty much only use the 32-bit version. So is it worth it to be using a really intensive application on a Windows on ARM device? Or how should developers go about making sure their applications work? Is it worth it? Sardar, that's probably something you can chat about.
If all you have is a standard 32-bit version and it's not a terrifically intensive application, if it's not Photoshop, for instance, then Microsoft has already taken steps to show that it will run as is in emulation. It may not necessarily run at the speed that you would expect from having a full x86 device, but it will run. But for applications like Photoshop, like I mentioned, anything which is really CPU intensive, you're absolutely not going to get the same experience at all. And the other question that comes from this is it worth it to recompile one's applications to target ARM because of that? And while the amount of work is not necessarily trivial, it all depends on the size of the application. So the larger the application and the more complex it is and the more CPU intensive it is to run it on a daily basis, the less of a return you're probably going to get on your investment, because your application is not even necessarily going to be targeting the people who are going to be using that hardware in the first place. So it's probably not worth it for the most part. If you have an existing Win32, the standard 32-bit version of what you're offering, and you're not interested in putting in the time, the resources to port it because there's just no audience there, then they can just run it as is, and they'll probably just live with the performance degradation for the time being.
And Microsoft, there have been a lot of reports saying that Microsoft is going to be working, or has been working, on getting Win64 apps to run on ARM. And if that's the case, then that sort of makes the issue moot, I think, for a lot of developers. Although, as you said, there'll probably be a performance hit, and these devices probably aren't going to be running high-powered applications anyway. And the other thing about it is that, apart from the technical side of it, I'm just thinking from a business side of it, Microsoft, while at one point it basically owned the world when it came to developers, they had to develop for Windows or they were dead. It's been many, 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 many years since that's been the case. Developers really have ignored Microsoft for many years. And, these days you're primarily writing for mobile operating systems. And so it's hard for me to imagine a real business case for many developers to recompile for ARM.
Or you're targeting the backend. You're targeting basically a server environment. You're running Java, or you're running a number of the other cloud-based languages. You're running something like Go, which is very portable across environments and across platforms. So the emphasis on targeting Windows as a development environment has really only made sense when the vast majority of the stuff that we were running only ran in the desktop. And I'm consistently impressed by the number of things that can be done in a web browser, with certain restraints imposed on the end user. But it really isn't the same world as before, and developers haven't been targeting the Win32 desktop as their first place, with the sole exception of things like gaming, which admittedly is a huge market, but it's also one very specific, almost custom market that really doesn't have anything to do with business computing as a whole in terms of what it's targeting and why.
And given that ARM is really, at least Windows on ARM is really built to run via the cloud. Really, it's not pointed at client applications. That's just one more point that agrees with what you're saying, Serdar. It's really, you develop the web app. I mean, why bother to go to a client version if it's going to be for an ARM device?
So it sort of feels like what you guys are perhaps saying, or maybe I'm curious to hear it in your words, is it worth it for developers to be focusing on Windows on ARM yet? And when will it become, or when should it become, a priority?
I think right now the simple answer is no, and that it won't even become something to be worth considering for at least 6 months to a year, because the ecosystem is still totally new. The hardware has just barely arrived. And also, like we've been saying, the general trend in terms of software usage and software development has been away from the confines of the desktop system. People are buying PCs a whole lot less than they used to, and they're using them a whole lot less than they used to as their primary systems. The use cases have narrowed considerably, but the people that do use them, they do tend to use them pretty religiously and for things that they just can't get anywhere else. If you're doing video production, for instance, if you're doing software development, if you're doing anything involving graphics, you are generally going to have to use a PC or nothing. And that really, I think, is the main reason why it's not worth it, is because at this point, so much of what we have done has just moved away from the desktop in general.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, I'd be really surprised. There may be a developer here or there who could find a real reason to do it, but I think it's going to be hard to find one who wants to do it for business reasons, not just a year out, but 2, 3, 4. It's hard for me to imagine it happening again. I think that's the past.
There are just so many specific things about the way that the web works as an environment now that has allowed this. Like, it's now that much easier to store data, large amounts of data locally in a browser, and to work with it than it was even 5 years ago, because of the APIs that are available in your average web browser to do exactly that. And these are things that have all made it that much easier to take an application that was previously only a desktop application, make it that much more of a web application. So it's also because web technology has grown tremendously and has become really a kind of a platform-independent runtime all of its own.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both so much for joining me. Before I let you both go, do you have any closing thoughts on Windows on ARM, or wish list? Do you wish it would happen? I don't know. Any closing thoughts for both of you?
Yeah, one, just to reiterate everything, at least that I've said, and I think Serdar has said also to a great extent, these devices are built for the web. Because of that, it's not likely that there's going to ever be a real reason for developers to get serious about developing specifically for them. They could probably just develop for the web, and they'll hit the target for these devices.
Well, the other thing that strikes me about them is they are really designed to take advantage of something that ARM has been trying to offer people, which is the tremendously reduced power consumption over Intel, even the most low power of Intel processors. The idea is that you would get that much better performance for that much less power consumption in general. And I love the idea of a Windows-based device that will run literally all day without me having to recharge. But if the trade-off for that is that I have to throw out everything that I use day to day in the first place, then it's not really a starter. But if I'm one of these people that has only just started computing, and all of the computing that I only know about is done through a web browser anyway, then it's not as big a sacrifice. So for someone like me, it's really not going to be very appealing. There's still things that I have to do on a desktop because they're just not offered anywhere else. In 5 years, though, that could be completely different. So, for now, I'm saying this is really not the thing for me, but I'm going to give it a couple of years and see what happens, because I could be really surprised.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for joining me once again. And if there's any sort of updates, perhaps sooner than 5 years, I'll definitely make sure that we have both of you back on to recap. So thanks so much. And thank you all so much for watching this episode of Today in Tech. If you liked this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Hit the bell icon in the corner so you're notified every single time we post a new video. Do you have any questions or comments about Windows on ARM? Please leave them in the comments below and I'll get back to you, or I'll get back to you on Serdar and Preston's behalf. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.